Well, archaeologists have actually known about the McCallum site since about 1950, but of course the people of this area have known about the site for much longer than that. In 1950, a woman named Marion Smith came here from Columbia University, and we assume that the locals told her that there was a site here and that there was a place, a village of traditional importance. The name that was told to Marion was Tsitsqem, which means either the slivers from the husk of the hazel or the bark of the Douglas fir. And if you look around here, there's lots of Douglas fir and lots of hazelnut trees. So Marion Smith, who was an anthropologist in the Columbia University, came here in 1950 with some people from the Provincial Museum, and in the tradition of that era, made a map and did some very quick excavating. Luckily, she only spent 3 days there, so she didn't do that much damage. But in fact, she gave us some insights into what the archaeology is going to be like. At that time, Marion made a map of the features that they saw on the surface, and we can only guess from how clear the map is that these features were pretty distinct. And what we see on the map are round houses, square houses, and oval houses. So it was clear enough then in 1950 that the map is got those kinds of details. So we're thinking that these houses aren't very old. Marion Smith excavated that part of one house, and actually it is the house that we are now working on today, and we hope to refine her trench. And what her notes say is that she found very well preserved posts and beams from the house, partially charred, and so we know since they're only partially charred, that is, that there's still some wood remaining, that it couldn't be that old, because of course in this climate wood would start to degrade after a couple hundred years. So we're thinking that she was working in a house that was probably a couple hundred years old, 200-300 years old, and is probably directly connected to the village of Tsitsqem. If you look on the field, you can see a lot of the changes in shadows and the depressions that Marion Smith and her crew would have seen in 1950. This field has since been plowed in, and those depressions have been filled in, but still you can see the darker spots in the plow zones there that are the remains of the houses that they saw and that we see on this 1950s map. The reason that we've plowed here, just to jump ahead in the story a little bit, is that we know from Marion Smith's map that Mr. McCallum, who was the owner of the property at the time, also plowed. So one of the problems archaeologists have is that if we want to understand what was happening in a village, it's very hard, given the detail kind of work that we do, digging in a 1 by 1 meter area, to actually figure out what's happening in the whole village. So we use the fact that it was plowed to our advantage. We found out exactly how deep it was plowed by digging small test units, and found it was plowed to about 10 centimeters in 1950. And then we got someone today to plow this area in these 2 big swaths in the hope that we could just turn over the soil that was already turned over 50 years prior. The idea being then, if there is artifacts that are emerging, bits of charcoal emerging, we can start to see patterning at the village level that we'd never be able to as archaeologists. So that's one really neat thing about this site, is that we have these depressions on the surface that correspond to this very detailed map of a site that's a couple hundred years old, that's tied to an oral tradition. The other thing is that we think the site is much more ancient than that, and that the tradition of people living here goes back thousands of years, maybe as much as 10,000 years. We know that because recently the road that is access to the site was expanded, and, as luck would have it, it took us enough of a slice off the side of the terrace here that it exposed a series of depressions, large depressions that we think are semi-subterranean houses. We assumed when we got here and saw these depressions that they were the same ones that were mapped in the 1950s. But now that we've kind of compared our maps with the old maps and have some radiocarbon dates on it, we see that what they saw in the 1950s was something more recent. What we're seeing in the profile, based on our radiocarbon dates, is at least 4,000 years old, and possibly as old as 10,000 years, which is very, very neat. So we're looking at a very long tradition of people living here. It's a perfect place for people to have been living. It was one of the first places to get high and dry after the glaciers receded 10,500 years ago. People could have moved in. It was a safe place to be. When the river was possibly flowing this way, it was a good place to get your food. Then it turned into a slough, another good place. It's a good view. It's a good way to see your enemies and your friends come, so you could greet them. And it was probably all around just a good stable place to have your village, so a place that we'd expect to see a long occupation.